This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation with Nick Ferrari at breakfast.
Good morning to you. 3 minutes after 9 on Monday, the 17th of September, and another day where you wake up to headlines concerning Brexit. But this time there seems to be some kind of confusion. For one newspaper, The Times, there's a boost for Mrs May as the EU backs the Irish border plan. For another newspaper, The Daily Telegraph, May's Irish Brexit plan is a disaster, warns former Foreign Secretary Boris Johnson. Well, here for his very important take, of course, on this, is Jacob Rees-Mogg, who's a Conservative MP, and, of course, is one of the key movers behind the European Research Group, the all-important group that was seen in action last week for the Conservatives. Mr Rees-Mogg, I have no doubt you turned to the front page of the Times first thing in the morning for many good reasons. Is this the boost that the newspaper is purporting to be as what we hear from the EU?
Well, I think it's very interesting that the EU seems to be moving towards the European Research Group's paper on solutions to the Irish border and is finally showing a little bit of flexibility. And you do begin to wonder if the Prime Minister, Theresa May, had been a bit tougher in her negotiations earlier, whether she might not have been able to get this before and moved in a much better direction than the Chequers plan, which is not really leaving the European Union.
So as far as you are hearing it, you support the line coming out of the EU?
Well, I wouldn't go as far as that, but it shows interesting movement, and it shows that they are more flexible than they've indicated before. And that's important because this is a negotiation, and so far it's been a lot of give by the UK and very little give by the EU.
Where does this leave Northern Ireland?
Where does this leave Northern Ireland?
I know you and your colleagues put a lot of work in on this last week. Well, you published it last week.
We published a paper last week that explained how you could avoid a hard border, but recognising that there already is a border and that this border will affect other things once we've left the European Union. You've got to accept the reality of leaving the European Union and not have the sort of magical thinking that some people want. And therefore, how do you solve it from the EU's point of view? The EU's been clear that its concern is the integrity of the single market. And if you look at other precedents from within the EU about how it maintains its other external borders, you can then work out how to have a solution for Northern Ireland that doesn't require physical infrastructure. And what the EU seems to have suggested in the Times and indeed in the Financial Times this morning is that they are willing to make some movement.
You'd support that?
Exactly what they've said isn't quite clear,
No.
and the details aren't there, but I think they're moving in the direction of the ERG paper, which is very encouraging, obviously.
How much of a key part of the final deal to put before Parliament would this be?
Well, solving the Northern Ireland problem is important in the context of a deal. Of course, in the event of no deal, then we don't have to do anything at all. It's simply up to the EU to decide what type of border it would want.
All right. And just before we take the first question, the work that the ERG published, how do you think it was received?
Well, what's so interesting is that nobody has managed to point out anything that we've got wrong. So people haven't accepted it, and some people have just been rude about it, which isn't a very high level of political debate. But nobody's been able to say, oh no, the EU doesn't do it that way. And that's the key, that we've got our facts right, we've got the EU precedents right, and therefore I think we've got a good solution to dealing with the EU's problem.
All right, let's go to the first of our calls. Robert is in Dulwich. Robert, you're through to Jacob Rees-Mogg. Go ahead. Good morning to you.
Good morning, gentlemen.
Morning, sir.
Look, in my opinion, Chequers isn't respecting the vote because it isn't really leaving. And in my view, Gove's suggestion prolongs uncertainty in the business community. Now, WTO would give us that certainty, and business could then sit around planning using the parameters of understanding what WTO means to them, because it's all written out, it's all quite clear. 200 countries use it. The question then is, should we be making a stronger case for WTO? Because the media, and in the last 2 years, these Remainers have really, they've discredited the idea of trading on WTO altogether. This idea of
I've got to move you to what your question. It's Nick Ferrari. Robert, I've got to move you to what your question is.
So do we do it? So for Mr. Rees-Mogg, is making WTO the case for WTO? Can that become a priority?
Well, Robert, I agree with you. I think that moving to a World Trade deal does give people certainty and speeds up the process. I think Michael Gove's suggestion is that you have an agreement now and then you reopen it immediately afterwards is something nobody's going to have any appetite for, that this is going to be the basis of our relationship with the EU, and that the WTO is nothing to fear, that most countries trade on that basis. We trade very successfully outside the EU on that basis, and economists for free trade have calculated that trading on world trade basis would give a very significant boost to the economy. So, Robert, I'm entirely at one with your opinion.
Robert, thank you for that. We move to other calls. Adam in Lewisham. Adam, you're on the radio. Good morning.
Morning, Nick. Morning, Jacob.
Good morning, Adam.
Jacob, my question. Sadiq Khan's backed a second vote on Brexit, and I think a few years ago you also thought that might have been the right direction to go in, but now you're completely against that. So I wondered why you've changed your mind.
Well, I haven't changed my mind. What I said was that David Cameron, before he went out to negotiate, might have wanted to get a mandate to go and negotiate and then put his deal to the British people. David Cameron decided not to have a mandate referendum and have one referendum. So I was discussing this at a point where things were very different and in a very clear context. Mr. Khan said after the referendum that the result was the result and it had to be respected. So if anyone's done a U-turn, it's the Mayor of London, not me.
Adam?
Yeah, I'm not sure about that, because I feel as though, we were unconstitutionally cheated into Brexit, and I think probably, we say Brexit means Brexit. Brexit means nothing. Brexit didn't mean anything when we voted for it. There was no plan. And, there's been this kind of history of dark horses coming into the Conservative Party, and I feel as though this whole thing has been more about party leadership than, anything to do with the public interest. So, do you have a plan for Brexit?
There's a plan for Brexit, but on your constitutional point, you're simply wrong that there was a general election saying we would have a referendum, there was a referendum backed by an Act of Parliament, and then there was a general election where over 80% of people voted for parties saying they would implement the referendum result. So constitutionally, it's been done completely properly. The plan I have proposed is that we move to...
Hang on now.
Oh, it was quite clear in the document that the government spent £9 million of taxpayers' money sending out, that we would leave the single market and leave the customs union. So leaving the European Union and the consequences of it was spelt out during the debate without question. But as to the plan which you asked about, I would propose moving to a Canada Plus style deal with the solution that we suggested for the Northern Irish question. And if not, there's the World Trade Deal to do. So actually, I've got two plans for how we could solve this problem.
All right, thank you for that, Adam. As you've brought that Irish question back into the conversation, perhaps I can just refer some of the column by Boris Johnson, the former Foreign Secretary, in today's Daily Telegraph. It's headlined, "The Irish backstop." I know he doesn't write the headlines, but "The Irish backstop is a monstrosity that wipes out our sovereignty." Discuss.
Oh, the Irish backstop, as proposed by the EU, that there should be a border down the Irish Sea, it is completely impossible for any UK government to accept. It is fundamental that the United Kingdom is an entity, it is a single entity, and it can't be treated differently at the whim of the European Union. So that's absolutely right.
It's a constitutional abomination.
I agree with that.
If Chequers were adopted, it would mean for the first time since 1066 our leaders were deliberately acquiescing in foreign rule.
I think we could argue over the date of 1066 because there's King John paying homage to the King of France, which is a little bit later, but the broad point's absolutely right, that the EU would make our laws without our having any say in it. So Chequers is a very bad plan. It is the vassal state in chains, and I think it must be rejected. And the Prime Minister's argument on the radio this morning that it was either her plan or leaving on WTO terms, in which case WTO terms would be much better. But actually, the only reason we've got the Chequers plan is that she didn't put forward a better one. It's not this simple either-or case.
You detect a tone of tack by the Prime Minister, Mr. Rees-Mogg?
No, I detect a change of tack by the EU on the Irish border.
I see.
And that, I think, is welcome, and that's what the Times and the FT are reporting. But the backstop as proposed by the EU so far, formally, is exactly as Boris Johnson says.
And just lastly, and the answer to this is ask him, but do you imagine Boris Johnson will welcome what we're hearing on the front page of the Times as perhaps this change of mood from the EU?
Well, I think if the EU is moving towards the ERG's proposal, Boris would be likely to welcome it.
Yes. You didn't all look very happy in that picture, did you, in the papers? I think you've got studying some papers, Boris has got his head in his hands, and Peter Bone is crying. Well, he's not crying, but he looks rather woeful.
I admire the ability of the photographer. If you hang around around for long enough, you can always find one of those perfect photographs. I have a habit of fiddling with my spectacles too much, so it's easy to get me in that.
So it wasn't doom and gloom?
No. It was a very upbeat presentation.
All right. It's good to get your views on other things. We're going to move away from Brexit. I'm sure it's a subject to which we shall return. Phil is in Hastings. Phil, you're on the radio. Good morning.
Hello, Jacob.
Hello, Phil.
I'm just wondering what the British government are going to do about Mr. Chowdhury, who's going to be released from prison, and also the 4,000 alleged people that are roaming the streets of Britain that are willing to kill British citizens.
Just to remind my listeners, you speak of Anjem Chowdhury, who is the convicted Islamist preacher. He was likely to be released on licence at some point next month. He approaches the midway point of his 5.5-year term. He was convicted of encouraging Muslims to join Islamic State, and the other number you give, of course, the number of people that various agencies say are actively monitored as they return from Syria and other parts. Jacob Rees-Mogg.
It's a very good question you ask, Phil, because one of the things we have to do when facing down terrorism is not behave in a way that undermines the standards that we have in the first place. And in this country, we have a very long-standing history of the rule of law and equality before the law and fairness before the law, and that therefore once people are tried and sentenced, they must be treated equally with other people. Now, if the sentence is wrong or too light, there are means of appealing it. If the basis for the sentence is too light, there are means of Parliament changing the law, but you can't have arbitrary law against individuals that you don't like. You have to prove a case against them, and they have to have committed a specific offence. And if we don't maintain that, that's a case of when the terrorists have won, because they've undermined something that is fundamental to the British nation and has been for hundreds of years. So you're right to raise the concerns about these people. It's right that the security services are monitoring them, but they can only be held in prison or prosecuted when they have broken a law.
But what do we do? Well, there's nothing we can do with Mr. Chowdhury, who's coming out.
Mr. Chowdhury's been sentenced, and the sentence is therefore proportionate to the offence that he has committed. It's worth looking if he's committed any other offences.
How comfortable are you with the fact he's on licence, he has to stay in a certain place, he has to be tagged, there are rules as regards his internet contact and other matters. How comfortable are you with those?
Well, I think it's important that he is monitored, and important that if he commits any further offences that he should be prosecuted for those. But it would be unfair and against the rule of law to say that his sentence must be extended because we don't like him, that would be arbitrary and would not be just and would undermine the British state as a founding principle.
Phil, thank you. Brian's in Chertsey. Brian, you're through to Jacob Rees-Mogg. Go ahead.
Morning, Jacob.
Good morning, Brian.
Just a point on Russia's recent activities invading our sovereignty by this Novichok business and killing one of our own people while attempting to kill a couple of their own, and their subsequent mocking of us concerning our concern about the use of this Novichok indiscriminately. Should we not just close down their embassy, send all so-called diplomats, who are also apparently are spies, back to Russia? Do we need to communicate with a regime like that?
How would you handle the Russian problem?
The Russian problem is very serious, and I think Putin is an absolute menace. I mean, he's a rather laughable menace because he half the time clowns around and doesn't take his responsibilities
quite
seriously.
A frightening clown, though, isn't
but
he?
He's quite a frightening clown, that's right. And what do I think we should do? I think we should take some money from the overseas aid budget and put it into our defence budget to boost our defences. I think we should make it absolutely clear that the Article 5 part of the NATO agreement will be enforced, and that we will protect the other member states that may be at risk from Russia. I wouldn't expel diplomats en bloc, because we need to have some relationship with Russia, and Putin won't be there forever, and we had diplomatic relations with the Soviets after all. What I would do is go after the money, as America has done, and I'd go after that really hard. And look
in what way, Mr.
Look at the oligarchs and where their money comes from, whether it is legitimate money, whether it's stolen from the Russian people, because the Americans have done this very successfully. It hits Russia where it hurts, because the Russian economy is surprisingly small. It's very dependent on oil, and if they lose some of their overseas reserves, that's a real problem for them.
Okay. Do you think that those two men we saw on television were going down to look at Salisbury Cathedral, Salisbury Church, the spire?
The Spire is one of the most beautiful sights in the country that you can see from miles as you drive into Salisbury, and they would have been wise to do so. No, I do not. And I think the Russians don't even pretend that they did, really. It's a sort of carry on being a murderer approach, and that's deeply frivolous and worrying that a supposedly serious country should behave in such a way.
Brian, thank you. Steve is in Great Dunmow, and you're on the radio. Steve, go ahead. Morning to you.
Hi there. Hi, Jacob. Hi, Nick.
Hello, Steve.
Hi there. I spoke to you before, Jacob, and I said about me wanting you to be our Prime Minister. But anyway, what I was going to say was, when is the Tory party going to get the message that unless they get rid of Theresa May ASAP, you are never going to be re-elected in future history? That's what I want. That's what I want to know, because it's not working out. We're running out of time, and if you want to be re-elected in 3 or 4 years' time, it's not going to happen.
Well, I think you make a very important point, that if we stick to the Chequers plan and we don't deliver Brexit, we do a half in, half out of the European Union, which Theresa May said was a rotten idea in her Lancaster House speech, then the Tory party will be in terrible trouble, because 70% of Tory voters have supported Brexit and expect us to deliver it properly. My view is that we want to change the policy and not the individual, and that that is the key to focus on, that I think it's easy to be distracted by the individual and find then that the policy isn't changed effectively. What we need is a change of policy, and the Prime Minister's saying today it's her deal or we leave on WTO terms. Well, great, let's leave on WTO terms, because her deal is terrible.
Steve, a response? You change the policy, not the person.
No, don't agree. I agree totally with Jacob about his politics. I really do like Jacob, and I want him to be the Prime Minister. But what I'm trying to say is that
I think there's a vacancy, is what Mr. Rees-Mogg telling me.
Well, and this is a common view. It's not my view alone. But anyway, what I'm trying to say, if Jacob doesn't want to be Prime Minister, that's fine. But the fact of the matter is, the Tory party, and I am very, very marginally a Tory voter. Very marginally a Tory voter. I will not vote Tory ever again if Theresa May stays as Prime Minister. And I'm telling you, the people, everybody I speak to is saying the same thing. You will lose 120 seats next election.
Let's just get a quick response.
I think what you're saying is very interesting and concerning. It's worth noting.
Speaking from Essex, of course, which was very much the foundation of Thatcherism, wasn't it? They won Essex.
Indeed, but it's fascinating that Tom Tugendhat and George Freeman, both on the left of the party, pro-Europeans, have been saying that they need fresh blood. I'm actually the loyalist and still supporting the Prime Minister and will continue to do so, but I'm very keen that the policy should be changed. But Steve, what you're saying is important, because politicians always have to be respectful towards the public mood.
Thank you for that. Let's just pause for a minute and bring in another part of the conversation. There was an exchange of communications between you and the leading Labour Remainer, formerly Andrew, now Lord Adonis. In fact, you sent him a 2 or 3 page A4 response to some of his replies, which he shared with me. But after that exchange, Lord Adonis seems to want to take it a little bit further, having read and digested your response. Here's a little of what he told me.
Jacob, it's taken him 4 weeks, but I understand that sharpening the quill pen takes some time, and the sharpeners aren't available every day. He has now replied, but he hasn't in fact answered most of my points. He's made a number of assertions.
This is the reply from earlier this week that I've mentioned.
Reply.
Yeah, 3 pages of A4.
And it plucks some numbers out of the air. It says out of nowhere that somehow there's going to be a saving of £100 billion from a no-deal Brexit.
Yes.
After the government has agreed and the Treasury has certified that the cost of the Brexit deal that is already in play will be £50 billion. So I think the right way to do this—
You're proposing a solution, Andrew.
I'm proposing a solution. I think we should have this out. You know, I'm going back to the 18th century because I always try to meet Jacob on common ground, and I have issued an invitation to him, a challenge to him to a duel. Now, in the 18th century, these duels were on Putney Heath.
Yeah.
Mr. Pitt fought a duel on Putney Heath and only narrowly survived it, apparently. The Duke of Wellington also fought a duel.
The Met are going to get involved, you know, if you start taking them to Putney Heath with pistols.
I took advice from the Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police, and she advised me the best way of conducting a duel in the modern world, which gives all of the elements of the challenge but none of the bloodshed, is LBC.
Right.
And, Nick, I understand you've risen to the challenge. You're prepared to host this duel.
Well,
and I am available. My second has been nominated. I am at the moment choosing the weapons, and I will be in the studio whenever you say if Jacob will respond positively.
Now, initially, the response from your office seemed to be negative. Jacob Rees-Mogg.
Well, I thought the whole thing was silly. The idea of a duel. I may be old-fashioned, but I don't think duelling brings credit to anybody.
Are you prepared to debate him?
I've debated my Lord Adonis before.
Yes.
I'm always happy to debate people, and if he wants to call in, which I understand he may be doing this morning.
Well, we can't seem to find him. This is his opportunity. He's not there.
They seek him here. They seek him there.
But you'll happily take a call from Andrew Adonis.
Yeah, of course I
will.
will. Delighted. Well, we had Sir Vincent.
Were you at Oxford or Cambridge? You did a debate at the Cambridge Union or the Oxford debate?
Yes, at the Cambridge Union. You're quite right.
That's right.
And Sir Vince Capel rang up once when I was doing my programme from Somerset. So I always welcome distinguished callers, but he's very selective in what he quoted from my letter.
Here we go. I love this.
I said there would be £100 billion Lord Adonis dividend if we scrapped HS2 and left the European Union.
Right.
40 billion of that comes from the European Union, and he ought to read the House of Lords report explaining this, which I pointed out to him in my letter. But the other 60 billion, and a figure that seems to go up and up every day, comes from getting rid of HS2, which is his pet project, which is one of the biggest white elephants this country's ever embarked on.
I sense a duel in the offing. Back to the calls. Gary in Sunbury. Go ahead, Gary. You're on the radio.
Good morning, Nick. Good morning,
Hello,
Jacob.
Gary.
Good morning, Gary.
Hi there. I just have a question for Jacob, which is really, how does somebody like yourself in a very privileged position begin to understand the genuine concerns that the average person has in relation to Brexit?
Well, the first thing I'd say is I don't think there's any such thing as the average person. I think everybody is unique and their interests and concerns are unique, and I value people as individuals, not as the collective. And the sort of phraseology average person, ordinary person, is, I think, slightly condescending to people who are all individuals. The second thing I would say is that as a Member of Parliament holding advice bureaus almost every week, many people come to see me and explain what their lives are like, and that it's simply being open to people and understanding and recognising that nobody leads anybody else's life. We all lead our own lives, and we can only have an understanding of other people's lives when they tell us or when we make researches into them, and that's inevitably what I do as a Member of Parliament.
Quick response from you, Gary.
Well, I understand you're saying that you can't categorise people as average, but by that I mean, for example, you may not be aware, but the average salary in this country is £27,000. If, for example, some of the stories we're hearing that food prices might increase, house prices might plummet, the NHS might be in crisis, these are things that are not going to affect you personally, but they will. And when I say the average person, I'm talking about the people that don't have the same wealth as yourself. So I think actually there are people that are average because they may not earn particularly good money, and if their food prices go up, they're going to feel the impacts a huge amount more than you will. If your bill at Waitrose or Marks and Spencer's goes up, you're not going to feel that the same way that the cleaner that cleans your house, for example, will feel when they're at the checkout at their supermarket. So actually I think it does. There are people that fall under that category that are not in the same position as you.
And Gary's call comes as one newspaper, I'm sure you're aware of this, the Daily Mirror reports that you've earned around £500,000 since the EU vote, Mr. Rees-Mogg.
Yes, but not because of the EU vote.
No.
So it's a completely bogus thing. My earnings have remained as they were before the EU vote.
Yes.
So it's a sort of silly story.
That's broadly what you have. I mean, you run a successful city company, and that's what you pay, and that's what blokes and women making that kind of jobs earn.
I set up my own business.
Yeah.
Essentially, I get that for...
But as you say, it's not influenced by the vote.
It's nothing to do with Brexit at all.
Yeah.
But if people want to add my earnings together over an extended period, they come up with a reasonably high figure. But, Gary, you make a very important point.
Because you won't suffer at Waitrose or Asda or wherever you go, Sainsbury's and the same with other food.
I wouldn't begin to pretend to.
No.
But what I think is very important is to understand that leaving the EU will reduce food prices because we won't have to put the very high tariffs on.
It's not at the moment, is it? If you go down the aisles now, it's ticking up almost on a weekly basis.
Partly because we had drought over the summer.
Yes,
and
can't blame
that's
that
not a matter of Brexit, is it? Even the BBC doesn't blame the drought on Brexit. So, Gary, you're absolutely right to raise these points. They are important. And if I thought that Project Fear was right, and had I thought it was right before the referendum campaign, I would have thought very carefully about whether restoring democracy was worth the price that might be paid. But as it happens, I think Brexit is an enormous economic opportunity that will make the least well-off in our society benefit most. Lower food prices, lower clothing, lower footwear, but also reducing the flow of unskilled labour coming into the country, which ought to increase wage rates for the least well-off. So my basis for backing Brexit is that it will be an economic benefit. And the one thing I will be affected by, as of course everybody would be in the country, is house prices. But that was suggested by the governor of the Bank of England, who is quite hysterical about Brexit and can't be taken seriously.
At all? We can't take the governor of the Bank of England?
No, he's a political apparatchik and has taken the governorship of the Bank of England from one where the odd movement of the eyebrows was influencing markets to one where he's a wailing banshee. I don't think it's at all distinguished.
I thought the city breathed a sigh of relief when it was announced he would stay. No?
Not this part of the city didn't.
We go to other matters. I don't know if your eye was drawn to a piece in one of the newspapers yesterday in the Sunday Times, where Carrie Simons, who of course was an aide within the Conservative Party, who may or may not have friendship with Boris Johnson, actually broke her anonymity concerning a piece that she wrote back in January, where she was one of apparently the victims of the black cab rapist John Warboys, who was convicted in 2009, and when her role in the party, she worked very hard to ensure that the man who is the most prolific sex attacker in the country kept behind bars, and the parole board did not fine for him. She said the way she was treated by the Conservative Party and bosses there for her role there is one of the key reasons why she left. What would you say if that's true?
I think that's terrible. I read her piece in the Sunday Times yesterday, which was a very powerful piece, and she was very brave to come forward. It's quite right, in my view, that Warboys remains behind bars. I think it was a mistake to take out the residual powers of the Home Secretary, now Justice Secretary, to overturn parole board decisions. I think you need to have public accountability, and taking everything away from politicians means that there's no democratic accountability for these choices being made. And I think that was an error, and I would like to see that final level of oversight brought back. And if she was treated like that, then the Conservative Party, rather investigating Boris Johnson on trumped-up charges, should look at itself and see what it got wrong, how it behaved, and who behaved badly.
What does it say of the perhaps chairman, Brandon Lewis, and running of the party?
Look, I don't want to blame Brandon, who was only just appointed as party chairman at that point.
What does it say of the party if it were true, Mr. Rees-Mogg?
Well, if it's true, it's deeply unsatisfactory that people should not be treated badly when they've been brave and have had a terrible thing happen to them and have been quite rightly involved in a public controversy. I think she deserves great credit for speaking out, and that what she has reported ought to be investigated and, if necessary, changes made.
Quick response on a story from another political party. Labour is calling for a ban on parents-to-be being told the sex of their baby after early blood tests amid fears it may lead to abortions of girls. The non-invasive prenatal test used by the NHS to test for genetic conditions. I'm not asking you to go. I know your position, and I respect that. But the idea of this proposed Labour ban.
Oh, I mean, I support this. That I think the idea that babies should be aborted on the grounds of their sex is particularly horrible.
And lastly, while we talk about babies and children, I thought the way you responded when that Class 4 activist arrived outside your home to try and talk to your nanny was superb. But I read a piece about concerning your nanny.
Oh, yes.
And is it true that just the sight... just the sight of one of these makes you behave instantly, and if so, why? I'm holding a wooden kitchen spoon.
Mr. Ferrari, I will now address you as sir.
What is it that Nanny did? What did she just had to show it to, or did she sometimes slap you?
Oh, never slapped. Never. No. It was just by the end, of course, it became a joke that I get the wooden spoon. But when you're little, you take these things very seriously and think that might be what's happening.
And your children the same? Does Nanny just
absolutely. Just the wooden spoon is the only
never touched a child at all
that is needed. No.
Just to show it.
But I enjoyed your interview with the anarchist. I made a mistake. I thought that by talking to him one could have a sensible conversation. As both of us found, that is impossible. That there's no response to any point. It's just a monologue of abuse, and you can't get anywhere in political debate like that. But I shouldn't have tried to engage him in conversation.
If Theresa May were to wave a wooden spoon at you, Mr. Rees-Mogg, what would your reaction be?
I think it would be very funny. Next time I ask her a question at PMQs, that's what she should do.
How marvellous. Good seeing you. Come and see us again soon. Thank you to Jacob Rees-Mogg, Conservative MP for North East Somerset, taking your calls here on LBC when news is next.
Jacob Rees-Mogg has told Nick the EU is moving towards his European Research Group's position on plans for the Irish border after Brexit. The Conservative MP says Brussels is beginning to show flexibility